Touch her waist again and lose that hand, the Mafia boss warned after my manager grabbed me. My manager's hand closed around my waist at 9:14 on a Friday night, and before I could twist free, a voice from the kitchen doorway said, quietly and without anger, "Touch her waist again and lose that hand." The voice belonged to Dario Ventresca, a man whose name made grown men in Baltimore change tables in restaurants. I was 37, the pastry chef of the Harbor Crown Hotel, and what I felt was not gratitude. It was anger, because I knew what everyone watching was about to believe. I should tell you how I got to that kitchen, because it matters. I started washing dishes at 17, spent 20 years earning my place in professional kitchens, and built the pastry program at the Harbor Crown from 2 ovens and a broken mixer into something food writers mentioned by name. My hands knew 300 recipes by memory. That hotel was the closest thing to a home I had ever owned, and everything that happened that night tried to take it from me. Wes Calder, my manager, had a habit of moving people. He steered you by the elbow, guided you by the shoulder, shifted you aside by the waist, always smiling, always in front of others, so refusal looked like overreaction. 14 years I had worked under men like him, and I had learned the arithmetic every woman in my trade learns, the paycheck against the complaint. That night, the ballroom was being set for a private banquet, and I was carrying a tray of finished petit fours toward the pass. Wes appeared from nowhere, gripped my waist with both hands, and lifted me half a step to the left, the way you might move a chair. "Careful, Brooke," he said, pleasant as a weather report. "Important guests tonight." His hand stayed on my side a moment longer than moving me required, fingers pressing flat against my apron pocket. I remember that pressure specifically because later, understanding it would rearrange everything I thought I knew about that night. Then Dario Ventresca, who had been standing in the doorway with 2 quiet men behind him, delivered his warning in a voice so calm it made the whole kitchen stop breathing. "Touch her waist again and lose that hand." Wes laughed it off, called it a misunderstanding, and walked away adjusting his cuffs. The banquet went on. The sugar work gleamed. And I stood there thinking the worst part of the night had already happened. I was wrong twice over. That is how much I did not see coming. By midnight, half the staff had decided I belonged to Dario Ventresca. I heard it in the service elevator, 2 waiters murmuring about Ventresca's woman. I heard it from a line cook who suddenly couldn't meet my eyes. 20 years of burnt forearms, missed holidays, and perfect soufflés, erased by 1 sentence from a dangerous man. He had turned my name into his property without asking me, and the worst part was that he had meant it as protection. Protection, it turns out, can be its own kind of taking. In the locker room, the conversation died when I opened the door, and that silence told me more than the whispering had. I untied my apron slowly, feeling 20 years pull at my shoulders, and wondered how you fight something that isn't an accusation, only a story. You can't cross-examine a rumor. You can't subpoena a smirk. I hung up my chef's coat, and it looked for the first time like a costume I had borrowed from myself. So I did something the waiters considered suicidal. I walked up to Dario in the corridor outside the ballroom, looked up at a man the police reportedly photographed at funerals, and told him he had done me no favor. I said, "In 20 years, nobody ever spoke for me in my own kitchen. Now I'll spend a month proving I'm not yours, and my work won't matter while I do it. Next time you want to help me, don't." My heart was hammering, but my voice didn't shake. He listened without interrupting, which surprised me. Men like him usually answer before you finish. When I was done, he nodded once, slowly, like a man accepting a bill he hadn't expected. "You're right," he said. "I saw something ugly and I spoke to him, not to you. That was my error, and I apologize to you, not to the room." Then he walked away, and I stood there with my prepared anger and nowhere to put it. I did not know that this small decency would cost me dearly. Before I tell you what happened at 1 in the morning, stay with me, because this is a story about what it costs to be believed. If you've ever watched someone get defined by a rumor in a single evening, like this video and subscribe. Somewhere tonight, a woman is untying her apron and doing the same arithmetic I did. Stay to the end. The hand from that opening scene reaches for me twice, and the second time, I was ready. At 1 in the morning, while I was cooling the last batch of hazelnut dacquoise, the night auditor and the hotel's head of security came into my kitchen together, and neither of them looked at my ovens. The executive office on the 4th floor had been opened with a master access card. A ledger was gone, a handwritten record of cash moving through the hotel's ownership accounts, the kind of book that is never supposed to exist. They were checking everyone's credentials, starting with banquet staff, starting with me. I let them search, because innocent people let them search. They went through my locker, my knife roll, my coat. Then the security chief asked for my apron, and from the left side pocket he drew out a black plastic card with a silver stripe. A master access card. The exact card reported missing from the general manager's office. It was the pocket on the side Wes had touched. I remember staring at it and feeling the floor of my life tilt. The night auditor asked me to explain the card, and I couldn't. Worse, someone had already pulled the corridor footage, and there I was on a monitor at 10:40, walking past the restricted hallway outside the executive wing, clear as a wedding portrait. I remembered going that way. Wes had sent me himself, said the service elevator on the far side was faster for the late delivery of chocolate work to the ballroom suite. It had seemed like nothing. Now it looked like everything. They didn't arrest me that night. They suspended me before sunrise, pending investigation, badge surrendered, keys surrendered, 20 years reduced to a signature on a form and a walk to the door. No one met my eyes. In human resources, a woman I had trained slid the paperwork across the desk without speaking, and her silence said what the policy could not. I was already guilty in the only court that mattered. A manager I barely knew walked me to the employee door like I was a shoplifter. In the parking lot, the air smelled of rain and the harbor, and I sat in my car for a long time without turning the key. Someone had built a frame around me out of my own apron, my own feet, my own ordinary night, and they had built it so well that for one dark minute I almost admired the craftsmanship. The next afternoon, Dario Ventresca's people found me at my apartment, and he arrived himself, which told me this mattered to him more than a hotel's missing book should. Because of course it did. The ledger, I would learn later, recorded payments tied to the silent ownership group behind the Harbor Crown, and it named the people quietly feeding him information about them. He had come to the hotel hunting that book. Someone had beaten him to it by one day and laid the scent across my doorstep. He sat at my small kitchen table in my apartment with the crooked blind and asked his questions in a level voice. Where was I at 10:40? Who had access to my apron? Who knew my habits? There was no threat in him, and somehow that was worse than a threat. The man who had defended me hours earlier now looked at me with the flat patience of someone rearranging facts, and I understood that I had become, to him, a puzzle that might be lying. "You're wondering if I used you," he said at last, "or if you're using me. I'll find out which. I always do." And here is the part that still burns. The doubt in his eyes hurt more than the handcuffs would have. Something had started between us in that corridor, some small currency of respect, and I had not realized I was holding it until I watched him count it back. I told him to get out. He went, and I hated how empty the room felt. I told him I would clear my name with my own hands, without his permission, his money, or his protection, and that when I did, he could apologize to me a second time. He stood, straightened his jacket, and left without answering. The door clicked shut like the end of something. I want to be honest with you. For one whole hour afterward, I wished I had let him help. Then I washed my face, found my notebook, and went to work. For 2 days, I did nothing but be angry. And then I did what I have always done when the world makes no sense. I went back to my kitchen logic. A pastry chef lives by records nobody else respects. Every oven logs its cycles. Every refrigerator logs its temperature. Every banquet has a timeline signed in triplicate. If I had truly been upstairs stealing a ledger at 10:40, then my kitchen would have been standing still. And my kitchen that night had never once stood still. The suspension days were the strangest of my adult life. I went to the farmer's market on a Tuesday because my hands needed something to hold, and I caught myself memorizing the price of rhubarb like it mattered. People I knew crossed the street to avoid asking me questions. That is the tax of accusation. Not the charge itself, but the way ordinary people start stepping around you, like you're a spill nobody wants to clean up. I baked bread at home just to prove I still could. I started with the ovens, because ovens don't lie and don't gossip. The hotel kept digital cycle logs for the big convection units, and that Friday, Oven 2 had run a timed program from 10:21 to 10:43. The delicate meringue cycle that requires me to crack the door at exact intervals. A cycle like that doesn't run itself. Someone had to be standing in front of it at 10:26, 10:33, and 10:41. I had been that someone. The machine said so, in ink. Then came the refrigeration logs. At 10:38, the walk-in temperature spiked and settled, which happens when a door opens for roughly 40 seconds. That was me, pulling the Dacquoise bases to check their set. I remember doing it while the hallway camera, 4 floors up, was supposedly photographing a thief who looked exactly like me. A woman cannot open a walk-in in the basement kitchen and a restricted corridor on 4 at the same minute. Physics, at least, was still on my side. The finishing photographs helped too. Every plated course for that banquet had been photographed for the hotel's portfolio, timestamps embedded, and there was my own left hand in 3 of them, my ring with the cracked opal, dusting sugar over tartlets at 10:31 and 10:45. I called my chocolate supplier, a blunt woman named Fern, and she remembered our 10:29 call about a late delivery because I had apologized for the mixer noise. Small, dull facts, rebuilding my life 1 page at a time. I chased dead ends, too, because innocence doesn't come with a map. I bought coffee for 2 bussers who had worked the corridor that night and learned nothing except that Wes had personally rearranged the service routes an hour before the banquet. I asked the night porter who had signed for the linen delivery and got a shrug. Every thread I pulled came up short, and each short thread pointed quietly and consistently in the same direction I was not yet ready to look. I took the whole reconstruction to Malcolm Vey, Dario's security coordinator, a methodical man who had clearly filed me under liability. He checked every record against the originals, twice, and I watched suspicion drain out of his face and something like professional interest replace it. "Your alibi is solid," he admitted. "You didn't take that ledger. But somebody wanted us busy looking at you. So the question isn't whether you stole it anymore. The question is, who dressed you up as the thief?" Dario heard the results and came to the kitchen that evening, after my suspension emptied the kitchen, and he paid the night manager to look away. I expected triumph from him, and "I told you so." Instead, he set the verified records down gently, like they were worth something, and said only, "You built this yourself. Good." No offer to fix my suspension, no call to the owners. Forcing them to reinstate me would have confirmed every whisper that I was his woman, protected and placed. He had actually listened to me. Meanwhile, the hotel's owners were pressing for a fast ending, and Wes Calder was leading the internal investigation with the sorrowful efficiency of a man burying a friend. He told the board the evidence was unambiguous. He suggested my 20 years made the betrayal all the sadder. Malcolm heard him say it and repeated it to me word for word, and I remember thinking that the frame around me was being painted gold, hung on a wall, and signed. So Dario and I fell into a strange routine. He had reasons to find that ledger, and I had reasons to find who framed me, and those reasons shared a bed. 3 or 4 nights a week, after midnight, we spread records across my steel work table, and the most feared man on the waterfront learned to tell a convection log from a proofing chart. I learned that he never raised his voice, never repeated himself, and stole food when he thought I wasn't looking. The first time I caught him, he was eating a burnt macaron out of the discard tray. Dario Ventresca, who according to legend once shut down a casino over an unpaid debt, standing in my kitchen at 2 a.m, eating my failures with the concentration of a jeweler. I said, "Those are the mistakes, you know." He said, entirely serious, "The mistakes have more flavor." After that, I left the burnt ones out on purpose, and he pretended not to notice that I pretended not to notice. One night I put a piping bag in his hand and made him attempt a rosette. His hand, which I'm sure had done terrible things, trembled over a cupcake like a student's. The result looked like a melted candle, and his man Malcolm, standing guard by the door, made the mistake of smirking. Dario handed him the next one. Within a week, I had 3 armed men doing blind tastings of my buttercream in dead silence, grading texture on clipboards Malcolm had actually made. It was during one of those long nights that he told me what was really in the ledger, and why the waiting men in his world were getting restless. It named the ownership group's silent partners, and it named his people inside their operation, men and women with families who would be finished if the wrong eyes read those pages. "Every day that book is out there," he said. "Someone who trusted me is standing on a trap door." That was the night I stopped being only angry for myself. There was no lightning strike between us, no violins. Respect came first. The way he took my oven logs as seriously as his own informants. The way he asked Ruth, the banquet captain, her opinion, and then actually waited for the answer. One night I found him reading my grandmother's handwritten recipe card like it was a state document, and he asked, sincerely, why she had burned the sugar twice. Somewhere between the burnt macarons and the clipboards, the doubt left his eyes. I'm telling you this because it's the truth of how it happened, and because it made what came next hurt so much worse. I had stopped bracing my spine around him. I had started leaving 2 cups out for coffee instead of 1. I am not a woman who softens easily, and I had softened, quietly, in a kitchen at 2 a.m, over ruined frosting and a man who thought my mistakes had more flavor. Remember that feeling. Hold it carefully, because the card was still unexplained. My alibi proved I hadn't stolen the ledger, but it couldn't prove I hadn't agreed to hold the card, and it couldn't name who put it in my pocket. Someone who knew my apron, my habits, my roots. Someone who could get within inches of me without raising an alarm. When I said it aloud in the empty kitchen, Dario went very still, and I watched him arrive at the same terrible doorstep. "Who touches you?" he asked, without you thinking twice. The answer led me to Ruth Brennan, 66 years old, 28 of them spent as banquet captain at the Harbor Crown, the institutional memory of the whole building. I brought her coffee on her porch in Locust Point and asked what nobody had asked her in years. Had other women ever had trouble with their credentials, their badges, their access cards? She looked at me over the rim of her cup, and then she said the sentence that cracked the case open. "Honey, it's always right after Wes gets handsy." Ruth had her own history with it, and she gave it to me plainly. In her 2nd decade at the hotel, she had watched a young waitress get escorted out over a missing key card, a girl who cried that she never touched the service office. Ruth had believed the file instead of the girl, and she had carried that like a stone ever since. "We were trained to trust paperwork," she said. "Paperwork is just what the powerful write down." She had waited 20 years for someone to ask. Ruth remembered Denise, a server who reported her badge missing 2 years ago and was transferred off banquet floors within a month, right after complaining that Wes kept guiding her by the waist. She remembered Priya, whose card was used to open the linen storage on a night Priya swore she was homesick, written up, humiliated, gone by spring. And Maria and Kelsey and a quiet banquet porter named June. Missing badge, then an unexplained access event, then the woman blamed or quietly moved along. I sat in my car outside Ruth's house and felt 20 years of small moments rearrange themselves. Wes's hands were never where you expected a manager's hands to be. A steadying grip at the elbow, exactly where badge reels clipped. a palm at the waistband, exactly where aprons tie, fingers brushing jacket sides where cards sit. We had all read it as entitlement, the petty thrill of a man who moved women like furniture. And it was that. But it was also something colder. Every touch was a reach. I brought the pattern to Dario and Malcolm, and for the first time, I saw them both lean in over the same side of the table. 5 women, 5 credential incidents, 3 years, 1 man at the center. But patterns aren't proof. Every incident was small, explainable, settled. There was no witness, no footage, no confession. Wes had built his whole system out of moments too embarrassing to report and too trivial to investigate. He had hidden a machine inside a mannerism, and it had been running for years. Ruth did something braver than she knew that week. She called the other women, one by one, and asked them to remember. Some hung up. 2 cried. Denise, now managing a diner in Dundalk, said she had waited 3 years for anyone to ask the question. Piece by piece, their memories arrived with dates and details, and every one of them landed in the same place. Within days of Wes putting his hands on them, their credentials had done impossible things. Impossible unless a manager's hands were a locksmith's tools. And that is when Wes Calder came to me with my life in his hands, smiling. He asked to meet at a harbor cafe, and over untouched coffee he laid it out like a banquet menu. My position back, full back pay, a settlement generous enough to change my decade, a spotless record. All I had to do was sign a statement saying Dario Ventresca had pressured me, manipulated the investigation, and coached my alibi. The board wants this over, he said. Be smart, Brooke. Take the win. Here is what I noticed while he talked, and it changed everything. He never once asked about the ledger. A manager whose hotel was robbed, who should have been desperate to recover it, cared only about what I would say about Dario. He didn't want justice. He wanted my mouth. Sitting there with his cologne in my throat, I understood that he needed my betrayal more than he had ever needed my silence, which meant the whole rotten structure depended on controlling the story. And he already owned the storytellers. So I made the hardest decision of my life. I told him I'd think about it, and I let him see me waver. Before I go on, let me ask you something, because I've wondered ever since. If a man offered you everything you'd lost, your job, your good name, and the price was one signature against someone who had doubted you anyway, what would you have done? Be honest. I nearly wasn't. Tell me in the comments. I still don't know if I'd judge you for signing. I decided alone because it only worked if it was real. If I told Dario, Wes would smell the setup, and the one chance to catch his hand in the machinery would die. So I met Wes again, and again, and again. I let him coach my statement, my grievances, my tears. I signed a draft accusing Dario of coercion and left it where it could be found. I turned myself into bait with my eyes open, and the price was that Dario had to believe I had sold him. But I refused to go in without a witness, so I did the riskiest thing of all. I went to Malcolm, not Dario. I laid out the pattern, the 5 women, the corridor, the settlement that ignored the ledger, and told him what I intended to do. He was quiet a full minute. Then he said, "He'll never forgive us," and slid a blank credential stock across the table. He would build me a twin card, perfect in every detail except one. It would open nothing. At our 3rd meeting, Wes grew careless in the way of men who think the game is already won. He asked whether banquet staff still clipped badges to aprons the way you do, and laughed at himself for noticing. He mentioned the loading level twice, casually, the way you mention weather. I played tired, played beaten, played grateful, and inside I was memorizing every word like a recipe. He thought he was rehearsing my statement. He was actually reading me his confession, one clue at a time. Dario found out about the meetings, of course. Men like him find out everything eventually. He saw the draft statement, or enough of it, and he came to my apartment on a Tuesday night and stood in my kitchen where we had laughed over ruined frosting, and he asked me one question. Is it true? I said, I can't talk about it. which was the cruelest true sentence I could find. And I watched something close behind his eyes, like a door being shut from the inside.
He didn't threaten me. He didn't rage. He said, "I see," in a voice with all the warmth taken out of it, and left. That was worse than any shouting. The midnight visits stopped. The burnt macarons sat in their little row for 4 days until I threw them away, because looking at them felt like looking at a grave. His people stopped returning Malcolm's calls, which terrified me, because it meant the trap now had only one person left who believed in it. Me. For 3 weeks I had built something with that man out of oven logs and burnt sugar, and I had burned it myself, on purpose, for a plan I couldn't share. I sat on the floor, my back against the cabinets, and cried for exactly 10 minutes, because that was all the grief my schedule allowed. Then I got up, washed my face, and finished preparing the trap. Whatever it cost afterward, I was going to be standing when Wes Calder reached into the wrong pocket one last time. The opportunity came with the Delacroix wedding. 400 guests, the biggest waterfront event the Harbor Crown had hosted in a decade. Florists, rental trucks, ice sculptures, a band, 3 catering teams, chaos wearing white linen. Wes reinstated me himself, triumphant, my statement scheduled for the following week. He needed one more thing that night, my apron, and specifically the credential clipped inside it. He believed it would open the secure loading level. What he didn't know was that Malcolm's twin card opened nothing at all. That morning, the hotel hummed like a struck bell, and I walked back into my kitchen wearing my whites for the first time in weeks, and my staff applauded, which undid me for exactly 3 seconds. Ruth was stationed at the service door in her captain's blacks, serene as a lighthouse. She had insisted on standing there herself. Malcolm was invisible somewhere in the walls with 2 men and a camera. The bride's cake stood 5 tiers tall. Everything was beautiful, and underneath the beauty, a machine was turning. I knew the real play because we had finally understood the shape of it. The ledger was leverage over the ownership group, and the ownership group answered to people who wanted Dario's interest in the waterfront ended badly. That night, men were coming in with the service traffic, through the secure loading level, using a card Wes believed was live. My card. The same pocket, the same routine, 3 years of practice behind it. All I had to do was stand where he told me to stand. Twice that evening, Wes tested me. Once he asked, in front of the banquet manager, whether I was comfortable with everything we discussed, watching my face for cracks. Once he touched my shoulder and let his hand linger near my collar, and I made myself smile the smile of a woman who had been bought. It cost me something I still can't name to stand still for that hand. But I stood still. The whole evening depended on him believing I had been purchased. At 9:45, with the bride's cake waiting and the band tuning up, Wes found me at the service station and told me to walk the trays down the back corridor toward the loading level. Halfway there, under a dead security camera he had chosen himself, he stopped me. And then it happened, the thing I had been waiting 3 weeks to see. His hand came up, casual as ever, and reached not toward my face or my shoulder, but straight for the left side pocket of my apron. The exact pocket. The same pocket as the first night. I caught his wrist, gently. No drama, no strength, just my fingers closing around his watchband, and I asked him the question I had carried like a stone. Why do you always reach for the same place, Wes? And he froze. Just for a second, less than a second, but I felt the whole rotten building of him shudder through that one arrested movement. He had rehearsed charm his whole life. He had never rehearsed being noticed. In that hesitation lived Denise's badge, Priya's write-up, my apron, my frame, everything. Then I did the thing that terrified me most. I let go. I let his fingers slide into my pocket and take the card, and I watched relief wash through him, watched him believe, one final time, that the pastry chef was just furniture that dispensed keys. He palmed it toward a florist's runner at the service door, and the card went down the chain, hand to hand, toward the loading level and the waiting truck.
What happened next looked from the ballroom like nothing at all, which was the artistry of it. A service door simply declined to open. A delivery was politely turned back. Malcolm's people photographed faces and plates in the rain and escorted two confused drivers off the property without a single raised voice near the guests, while upstairs 400 people danced to a brass band and never knew. Dario had promised no blood in my house, and the most dangerous man in Baltimore kept his word.
Wes didn't know it had failed yet, and that was my moment, the one I had earned.
I met him in the service corridor with Ruth beside me, and laid it out in a voice I barely recognized, calm as piping icing. The oven logs, the corridor he had sent me down himself. 5 women and 5 badges. A settlement offer that cared nothing for the stolen ledger. And a manager's hand, just now, reaching for the exact pocket where a planted card had once appeared. "It was never just touching, was it?" I said. "The touching was the cover. The touching was the job." He tried charm first, then authority, then the thin edge of threat, and I watched each one die against the facts. Ruth spoke then, 28 years of memory in a captain's measured voice, naming names and dates, and Wes Calder finally understood that the women he had counted on to stay embarrassed had simply been waiting to be believed. The shame he had counted on was finally testifying. By the time Dario arrived, unhurried, the way weather arrives, the confession was already broken apart on the floor. It was mine. I had taken his whole machine down with kitchen records and an old woman's memory. Wes looked past me to the man in the doorway and actually smiled, almost relieved, because violence he understood and could use. Everyone remembered the first night's promise, the hand, the warning. Lose that hand. Dario looked at Wes a long moment, then at me, and he waited. He was asking without asking, and I said, "No, he's going to lose his name, his job, and his freedom, in daylight, with paperwork. He doesn't get your version." Dario held my eyes, then stepped aside. The hand was never raised. The promise was kept by being refused. Wes Calder was walked out through the service corridor he had used as a hunting ground, past the women he had moved like furniture, and they watched him go. If this story has meant something to you, if you believe the quiet women in the back of every workplace deserve to be believed the first time, then like this video and subscribe, because I tell stories about people the powerful mistake for furniture. There is another story like this one every week, and I would hate for you to miss it. These stories are for people who know that quiet is not the same as weak. The aftermath was all signatures and sunlight, which was exactly right. The wedding evidence, the card chain, the drivers, Ruth's testimony, and the recovered ledger together pulled the thread out of the ownership group, and the Harbor Crown's board, its lenders, and its insurers ran from those people like a fire alarm. The ledger was turned over through legitimate legal channels, with the names of Dario's informants protected, because he had bargained for that before his own interests. That told me something about him, too. Wes lost his position, his standing, and the protection that had made him untouchable, and he answered for the access scheme through ordinary courts, in an ordinary suit, diminished to his actual size at last. The hotel changed its credential policies within a month, and the new handbook has a page about unwanted physical contact that Ruth Brennan helped write. Denise got a letter of apology and a job offer. 3 of the 5 women came back. The ones who didn't at least got the truth. The hotel reopened under clean management in the spring. They offered me leadership of the whole pastry program, and I want you to know exactly why, because it matters. Not because of Dario. He never made a call. I got it because of 20 years of work, a reopening menu that sold out in 6 days, and recommendations signed by Ruth Brennan and half the senior staff. My name went on that door because my name had earned that door, twice over, once in sugar and once in ash. Dario came to my office one afternoon and stood in the doorway the way he had that first night, and he said the hardest thing a man like him can say. "You fooled me," he said, "completely. I told myself I trusted you, but the truth is I only trusted you while I understood your moves. The moment you made one I couldn't see, I believed the worst. That isn't trust. He said he was learning that at 56, which was late, but he was learning it from me. I told him what I had figured out alone on my kitchen floor. Real trust doesn't begin with understanding. It begins exactly where understanding ends. He was quiet for a while, and then he asked if there were any burnt macarons. There were. I'd been saving them, which was my confession, offered in a paper box. He ate two, grated the third out loud, and somewhere in that ordinary afternoon, the door behind his eyes opened again. I did not call it forgiveness. I called it a beginning. Months later, after the reopening gala, the ballroom emptied and the band went home, and I stayed to check the last of the dessert display because old habits own me. Dario was waiting by the dance floor, alone, no men, no agenda, and asked me to dance to the music the crew had left playing. So we danced, badly, slowly, two people who had both survived learning to trust, and as we turned, his hand moved toward my waist, and then it stopped, an inch away, and hovered there. He didn't ask. He just waited. This man who had finally understood that the inch between his hand and my body belonged to me, had always belonged to me, and that was the entire difference between him and the man who was gone. So I took his hand, and I placed it on my waist myself, deliberately, in front of no one but us. The same spot, the opposite meaning. Where Wes had taken, Dario waited. And what is given freely is worth more than everything that was ever grabbed. My name is Brooke Hadley. I cleared my own name with oven logs and the memories of women nobody had believed, and no one touches me without my permission ever again. Before you go, tell me in the comments, was I right to shut Dario out of the plan, or should I have trusted him with it from the start? And if you want more stories where the quiet ones win, subscribe and stay close. From my kitchen to you, thank you for listening all the way to the end.